Hey folks, how you doing? Dave McRae here. Today we're going to talk about horror icons of the 1980s, and specifically whether or not Michael Myers should be considered a horror icon of the 1980s, or whether he's really a horror icon of the 1970s, and why Michael Myers, when compared to arguably the two greatest horror icons of the 1980s, Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, didn't seem to appear on anybody's radar for some reason. Now look, before anybody gives me a thumbs down, okay, and a nasty comment and loses their shit, I did not say that Michael Myers wasn't a horror icon. I said that maybe Michael Myers isn't really a horror icon of the 80s, but in fact, maybe more so the 70s. Even though I know he does appear on pretty much everybody's, top horror icons of the 1980s list, and there's very good reason for that, which I will get into a bit later, of course. Look, Michael Myers is absolutely, unequivocally, one of the greatest horror icons in the history of motion pictures, period. He's one of the greatest horror icons in the history of horror, period, okay? Halloween is my favorite horror movie, period. Michael Myers is my favorite horror character, period. And if you think I'm lying, just look at my channel, for fuck's sakes. I mean, come on. That being said, okay, a couple of days ago, a buddy of mine asked me the question. He said, Dave, why do you think Michael Myers is not really considered a horror icon of the 1980s? And my gut reaction, my immediate response wanted to be, what the fuck are you talking about? Of course he's a horror icon of the 1980s. But I thought about it for a moment, and I thought, you know what, you're right. And there's one huge reason as to why, and there's one smaller reason as to why, which relates to the huge reason. Really, I could just talk about the huge reason, but because I'm the age I am, 38, and I grew up in the 1980s, and I was a teenager in the 1990s, anybody my age, maybe a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger, who wanted to dress up as Michael Myers will be able to relate to this. So I thought I'd throw this reason into it as well. And the smaller reason that I'm going to talk about right now is sort of a direct result because of the big reason. It was very frustrating as a kid. It's a great segue into why that is and all that kind of shit. So anyway, so when he asked the question, I thought about it and I was like, yeah, you know what? He's right. So let's start with the two big reasons, or the two reasons, the smaller reason and then the huge one, of why Michael Myers, by and large, is not really a horror icon of the 1980s. Well, I'm going to start with this. First of all, like I said, if you're my age, 38 or a bit older or a bit younger, and you wanted to dress up as Michael Myers for Halloween in the 1980s or even the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s, you couldn't. You basically couldn't, okay? You could not go into a store and buy a Michael Myers mask. You just couldn't. They didn't exist. And the ones that did exist, 9 times out of 10 weren't selling as Michael Myers masks. It's not like you go to a store, you're like, oh yeah, and you knew it was supposed to be the Michael Myers mask, but there was no tag on it that said like Michael Myers mask. You know what I mean? It was just sort of this white face with the brown eyebrows, and you're like, okay, yeah, I think that's what that's supposed to be. And because it was the only thing you could get, you looked at it and you were like, yeah, this is it. This is totally Michael Myers. Yeah. And you put it on, you'd walk around and be like, I'm fucking Michael Myers, man. I look like Michael Myers. Until you'd show up at your friend's house, or you'd show up at your Halloween, party at school, or you'd do something with your parents or your family, and they'd all be like, oh, Jason. You'd be like, no, I'm not Jason. Or you'd try to explain who you were. I'm Michael Myers. And they had no idea who the fuck that was for some weird reason. And you had to explain it like, the guy in the white mask. And they were like, oh, Jason. And you're like, no, not Jason, Michael Myers. You're like, well, you said the white mask and and you're like, no. It was so frustrating. Look, it wasn't until recently, as like 5 or 6 years ago, when Trick or Treat Studios really came on board and started selling pretty decent looking Michael Myers masks for pretty decent prices, 50 or 60 bucks US. It wasn't like that in the 1980s, and it wasn't like that in the 1990s. Trust me, I had the masks they sold in the 80s and 90s, and it was, look, at the time I was like, yeah, I look like fucking Michael Myers. Now I'm like, I have photos. I wish I had the photos here. I have photos of me dressed at, and you're like, who the hell is that? Who are you supposed to be? Oh, Jason, no. So anyway, look, to me, the gold standard of Michael Myers masks today are still coming from the independent artists who create those screen-accurate, awesome-looking Halloween 1 masks, Halloween 2 masks. That, to me, is where the bar is. That, to me, is the gold standard still to this day. But, having said that, I have to admit that the stuff coming out of Trick or Treat Studios and even I think there's a couple other companies that make some pretty decent looking ones, are not bad. They're not bad. Look, if those masks, the ones that Trick or Treat Studios are putting out, were around in the 1980s or 90s, oh my God, as a kid, you'd be like, but because we have to compare them to the ones that the independent artists are creating, it's kind of like, you know what I mean? But they're pretty good, nonetheless. For a $50 mask, yeah, you know you're supposed, like, when I see that, I'm like, yeah, that's supposed to be Michael Myers, and that's what you want. There's a very specific reason why your parents had no idea who the hell you were. There was a very specific reason that why when you put on that white mask, it wasn't that you didn't look like Michael Myers, okay? There was a very specific reason why your friends thought you were Jason, or why your teachers thought you were Jason, or why your parents thought you were Jason, or why your friend's mom thought you were Jason. There's a very specific reason for that. Let's talk about the real reason why Michael Myers was pretty much MIA for the entire decade of the 1980s and why he wasn't on anybody's conscious mind, essentially. And why you or I was being mistaken for Jason Voorhees. I told you it was related. So let's first look at the Halloween movies, okay? So Halloween 1, as we all know, came out in 1978. But that's the late 70s, so we have to push that aside, okay? We can't include that film. Its sequel, Halloween 2, as we all know, came out in 1981, okay? The next time we see Michael Myers after that movie is not until Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, which didn't come out until 1988. So there is a 7-year gap of no Michael Myers whatsoever, okay? In terms of movies I'm talking about. I don't know if there was books or comics or just don't do that, okay? You know what I'm talking about, all right? And I know in Halloween 3, The Season of the Witch, I know that there's that scene where there's the Halloween promo on the TV and you see Michael Myers and don't. Why? Okay? You think you're smarter than me? I'm just kidding, relax. But you know what I'm talking about, right? So we don't see him again until Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. So there's this 7-year gap where there's nothing. And as I said, we all know that Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, had nothing to do with Michael Myers. So now let's take a look at arguably the two greatest horror icons of the 1980s, or at least the most popular, the two you hear about the most, or you heard about the most, which of course is Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. And why they outshone Michael Myers. And you probably know where I'm going now with this. It's pretty self-explanatory. In that 7-year gap, okay, let's look at the films that Jason Voorhees had. Now, we all know that he did not appear, spoiler alert in case you haven't seen the first Friday the 13th. And yes, I know that technically he did appear in the first Friday the 13th at the end of the movie when he came out of the water. I'm talking about as the main antagonist, okay? Jason did not appear in the first Friday the 13th. It was his mom that did the killing, which was great, by the way. They could have just left it at that and would have been awesome. But anyway, so let's look at the films he did appear in. His first appearance was in 1981, the same year Halloween 2 came out, in Friday the 13th Part 2. And then he appeared again in Friday the 13th Part 3 in 1982, and then again in Friday the 13th Part 4 in 1984, the final chapter, and then he didn't appear in 1985, okay, in Friday the 13th Part 5, like, Jason Voorhees himself wasn't in Friday the 13th Part 5, but the aura and the essence and the goalie mask and the Jason vibe and the Jason character, for all intents and purposes, was in A New Beginning, Friday the 13th Part 5 in 1985, even though I know it wasn't specifically Jason Voorhees. So I'm going to include it because he was dressed like him and he was supposed to be taking on the Jason sort of vibe, right? So we'll include it. And of course, he was in 1986's Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, in 1988's Friday the 13th Part 7, A New Blood, in 1989's Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. So you look at that and you go, holy shit, there's 8 movies of Friday the 13th in the 1980s. 8 movies of Friday the 13th in the 1980s. And 7 of them, I know you could say 6, but 7 of them have Jason in them. Whoa. And in between 1981 and 1989, if you include 1981 and 1989, you have Friday the 13th 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You've got 7 Friday the 13th movies, 7 Jason movies, in a period where there's only 3 Halloween movies. Wow. Okay. So when Michael was asleep, Jason was doing his fucking thing. Makes sense. Makes sense. You look to A Nightmare on Elm Street, the first A Nightmare on Elm Street was 1984, the second was 1985, the third was 1987, the fourth was 1988, and the fifth was 1989. So you've got 5 movies now of A Nightmare on Elm Street in the decade of the 1980s in a period where there was only 2 Halloween movies. Yeah, like when you break it down like that and you look at the numbers and you look at the decade and you look at when the films were released, okay, and you look at that 7-year gap, which hurt Michael's character. It hurt Michael's character. And look, come on, let's be honest, okay? Halloween 4 is a decent sequel, but it's not great. Halloween 5 is garbage. It's a fucking shit show. So one could make the argument, that there was really only one good Halloween movie with Michael Myers in the entire decade. If you really think about it, right? I mean, you could make that argument with a few of the Friday the 13th and Elm Streets as well. But yeah, and when I broke it down like that, I realized that is why, and that's why there was a movie, Freddy versus Jason. Right? That's why it wasn't Freddy versus Michael versus Jason, or Jason versus Michael, or, Freddy versus Michael, or no. That's why people wanted a Freddy versus Jason, is because they were the horror icons of the 1980s. And then there was Michael, was like the little brother that just didn't appear anywhere. He was like late to the fucking party. The Halloween people couldn't get their fucking act together. They didn't know what the fuck to do with it. They wanted to make an anthology film, but Mustafa Akkad wanted, to bring Michael back, but how do we do it? It was a shit show. The rights were going around, pretty much like how it's always been. So they just couldn't get it together, and Michael's persona and his mystique in the 1980s definitely suffered because of that. Now, you can disagree with me and you can give me a thumbs down and make a nasty comment and shit like that, but the numbers don't lie, folks. This is why if you were a kid who dressed up as Michael Myers in the 80s or in the early 90s or even the mid 90s, before H2O, even before, you could argue before Halloween 6 too, but if you were a kid that dressed up as Michael Myers and nobody knew who the fuck you were, it wasn't just because you had a shitty mask. It was because no one knew who the fuck Michael Myers was. He wasn't on anybody's tongue. He wasn't on anybody's conscious mind. But Jason was. It was Friday the 13th everywhere. Every year there was a fucking Friday the 13th movie. Almost every year there was an Elm Street movie. You know what I'm saying? So, and you could go into a store and you could buy a goalie mask that looked like Jason. You could go into a store. Do you remember the Freddy glove with the plastic knives and the hat and the mask? I know you guys remember that. If you're my age, you totally remember that shit. And you could go in and everybody knew who you were. You couldn't do that with Michael Myers because Michael who? You mean that movie that ended like, whatever. Nobody, Michael Myers is absolutely a horror icon. Yes, he is a horror icon and one of the greatest in the history of motion pictures. Absolutely, unequivocally. You can go online and I'm sure you can bring up posts and websites that will include him in there. Sure, they will include him in there, absolutely, because it's almost weird if you don't include him in there because of how influential the character and Halloween has been overall. And yes, there were some movies that were released in the 80s, and yes, He is one of the greatest of all time. So it does seem kind of weird not to have him in there, especially since so many iconic horror characters were created in the 1980s. The decade of the 1980s saw a rebirth and surge in the horror genre again. Freddy Krueger was created in the 80s. Jason Voorhees was created in the 80s. Pinhead from Hellraiser was created in the 80s. Chucky from Child's Play was created in the 80s. But the reason why they're considered 80s horror icons is because not only were they created in the 80s, their best movies were in the 1980s. Many Hellraiser fans consider the first two Hellraisers to be the best. Many Child's Play fans consider the very first Child's Play to be the best. It's creepy, it's eerie, it's weird. Chucky is really fucking scary in that movie. He's very much like what Freddy Krueger was in the very first Elm Street. And then of course, by Child's Play 4 and 5 and 6 and God knows what else is coming down the pipe, he was a comedian. He became comical, very much kind of like what Freddy became by, Elm Street 3 and 4 and 5. And they weren't really scary, they were just sort of fun not to be taken seriously, where the very first Child's Play was very fucking serious, and the very first Elm Street was incredibly serious and scary as well. So Chucky and Pinhead are often considered icons of the 80s, not just because they were created in the 80s, but because their best movies were in the 80s. Now, I also know that Leatherface will often appear on the 80s horror icon list as well. But I don't really consider Leatherface to be an 80s horror icon. I consider him to be a 70s horror icon because the best Texas Chainsaw Massacre film came out in the 70s. So you could make the argument in the case of Michael Myers that maybe he's a 70s horror icon because arguably the best Halloween was the first one, and that came out in 1978. Now, you could make the argument that, the best one is 1981's Halloween 2. You could, but by and large, a lot of people consider John Carpenter's classic to be the gold standard of the Halloween films, and that was in 1978. So for me, when I think of horror icons of the 1970s, I kind of think of Michael Myers because not only was he created in the 1970s, his best movie was in the 1970s, but if you break down the numbers and if you quantify it and if you look at it and if you think about it, why he was not on anybody's conscious mind, and this is generally speaking, okay? This doesn't mean that maybe some people did know who you were. Maybe your parents did know. Maybe your friends did know. I'm talking by and large, folks, and people are probably going to comment below and they're probably going to say, dude, I know. I fucking know. I know, man. I know. I dressed up as Michael. I tried to be Michael. I tried to explain who Michael was, and they were always like, oh, you mean Jason? No, not Jason. You know what I'm saying? Even though you didn't have a goalie mask on, and even though you were trying to explain it, they're always like, you mean Jason? You mean Jason, right? No! That's why. Because when you look at the numbers and you look at how many Friday the 13th movies with Jason, how many Elm Street movies were released in that 7-year gap where there was no Michael, it speaks for itself. It's like, oh, that's why. And again, you could argue that there was really only one good Halloween movie in the decade anyway, okay? And that came at the beginning of the decade, and then it was just quiet. That was it. So anyway, folks, my name's Dave McRae. Those are my thoughts on why Michael Myers is not really considered a horror icon of the 1980s in my books. When you look at the numbers, okay? That doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean he's not a horror icon. He is. Don't comment below and start saying, what the fuck are you talking about? He is a horror icon. Because if you do that, then that just tells me you didn't watch my video at all and you completely misunderstand what I'm trying to say. Anyway, my name's Dave McRae. Comment below, let me know your thoughts. Yeah, hope you guys are having a good time. Hope you guys are having a good summer so far. It's really late as I'm shooting this video. It's 12:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the 16th of June, 2017. Hope you guys are having a great summer. Talk to you soon. Cheers.